Thank you for inviting me. Before we move on to the panel, I believe there's a poll. So if we could launch the poll. The poll's looking at impact investing and where we are today. So is it early days? Is it growing steadily, established and mature, or saturated already? And also, I would also like to keep this session very interactive. We're going to leave 20 minutes for Slido, the questions to come from the app, and also have a mic around the room. There's very few of us. Hopefully more people will come back from the coffee break. But it would be lovely to have people take the mic and speak and ask their questions. With that, I would actually like to invite the panelists to come up on stage. So we're very fortunate to have a very diverse group of panelists today. We have a family office, we have a climate fund, we have a leading agency in international development, UNDP, and we have a private bank that's a pioneer in impact investing and has a suite of offerings for its client base. So we have at the tail end, on my right side, we have Callum Hansworth, who's from UNDP, from the Global Center for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development. We have Ern Lee, Managing Director, Head of Sustainable and Impact Investments Asia from LGT. We have Thomas Knudsen, Director, Rumer Group, a family office. And then we have John Sharp, Managing Partner, Hatcher, a $250 million climate fund. At AVPN, as I was introduced, I serve as the Chief of Sustainable Finance, and we're a members network. And when we talk about investing with impact, we talk about a continuum. We look at impact investing in a spectrum of investments where philanthropy sits on one side and public markets with a strong focus on ESG on the other. Impact investments is, many of our members look at it with a finance first lens and others look at it with an impact first lens. It's primarily the private markets that we're talking about as opposed to public markets. We work with all our members, whether it's finance first or whether it's impact first, to connect them with the right opportunities. We've seen currently with hopefully the pandemic's behind us, but we've also got a number of macroeconomic issues that we're dealing with, climate change, of course, being foremost, but we also have an ongoing war. We've seen issues around ESG washing, impact washing, greenwashing. That's added to this mix. With all of that, we've seen SDG commitments and the numbers needed to meet the SDG targets drop. We need about $3.5 trillion a year to try and get to it for 2030, and we're nowhere near close. So I'm going to ask the panelists today to try and address some of these issues. How can impact investing help us achieve the SDGs? And I'd like to start with each of our panelists to basically talk about their day-to-day work and how is that helping to achieve the SDGs? How can we mainstream impact investing? So with that, I'd like to start with you, Ern. LGT has closed its latest funds, and you've been, as I said, one of the pioneers in impact investing in Asia. In your opinion, how has impact investing fared recently, given the recent macroeconomic issues that we're dealing with?
Work? Okay. Hi, everyone. First and foremost, so thanks Jess and Eco Business team for bringing us all together. I think, having sat through a decade of conferences and panels, I think it's really great that we can actually be intimate enough to ask provocative questions. So I really hope that today we can deepen the conversation a little bit by having more of a provocative conversation, challenge issues. So against that notion, I think, I saw the poll earlier. Most of you think impact investing is early days. It's great because 10 years ago when I asked questions like, what is impact investing? Some people said, oh, do you invest in dynamite companies? Which is a different kind of impact. So when I said, oh, we invested in social enterprises, they said, oh, you mean like Facebook? I said, no. Today, impact investing and ESG are ubiquitous terms. So I think from a knowledge point of view, we've moved the needle quite far. And unfortunately, what's driving that is both a pro and a con. The pro in the sense that there are a whole bunch of younger leaders, new financiers, new investors that believe that you can drive profit with purpose. And as I don't need to go into that detail, but at the same time, we are all talking in the last couple of hours about all the black swan events, from climate to inequality to lack of access to poverty, environmental degradation, and so forth. So there is a real need for it, and it's that convergence point that brings impact investing to the fore. And I don't need to remind anyone here, nor the panelists, that Asia presents, in my view, the greatest opportunity for that, because you've got the greatest wealth accumulation coupled with the biggest developmental challenges in the same place, right? In the past, you've had a lot of wealth in the US and Europe, but for causes that are outside the neighborhood. This is here, and it's now, and it's urgent. Oh no, I completely missed your question.
What are you doing to achieve?
So what am I doing to achieve it? Sorry. I learned from attorney over here. The strategy was to distract the audience and make them laugh because that's all they remember. So what are we doing? And I guess maybe I should be on a serious note, maybe address Kamal's question, right? There's a lot of backlash with ESG recently. And although USG, who here does not know what ESG means? I think it's ubiquitous, but when asked how to apply it, a lot of people get it wrong. And when you look at sustainable investing, I often say there's the simple ABCs. If the only thing you remember from today's ABCs, I'm pretty happy. A, meaning you can avoid the harm, right? There are plenty of people that take out coal, that take out sin industries, tobacco, alcohol, ammunitions. There's the B, which is benefiting stakeholders, where you're integrating ESG considerations to ensure that you're not just profiting your shareholders, but your broader stakeholder community, right? Your employees, the supply chain, and so forth. But the C is what we should really be concerned about. And how do you contribute to solutions? And this is in the spectrum, at least that Kamal refers to, where impact investing is super powerful because you're actually contributing to solutions. You're not just measuring your carbon footprint, telling me that the employees are fairly documented and have health and safety and insurance and all that, and there's proper governance. You're actually contributing to solutions. So Kamal, to your question, how as impact investors do I think it happens? I think we're doing a great job, but I just think that not enough of us. And that's really the challenge. There's not enough of us, and there's not enough investment dollars going to the urgency of the problems.
So Thomas, that leads on to you. As a family office, what can you do to encourage that? What have you witnessed? Because a lot of times people think about impact investing resulting in concessional returns, them having to take a financial haircut. What do you see is possible in the impact investing space?
So give me a little bit of latitude. I'm not losing the plot here, but I'm a good son, and I'm going to call my mom tonight. And I'm going to tell my mom that I went to the Four Seasons Hotel, and I sat down with a lot of beautiful, smart people who've got degrees and work for banks and investment funds. And she says, oh my God, son, I'm so proud of you. You really made it. And she's going to say, what did you talk about? And I said, we're talking about saving the planet. We're going to do all this good stuff and so on. She said, that's wonderful, my son. I'm so proud of you. So what are you going to do? And then I'll probably say, well, there's all these problems with, all these things. And she said, no, what are you going to do? See, that's the conversation we had in our family 5 years ago. We said, we are giving money away to what is our family's great passion, which is the ocean. And we feel that we're doing all the right things, but we're not making any progress. My wife had the pleasure of meeting with the Gates Foundation, and the Gates Foundation said, do you know that only 3% of global philanthropy goes into conserving the planet? 30% goes into religion. I think there's a problem there. Keep on giving to religion, but let's do some more for the planet. So we said, how can we address or do something as a family in that? So we said, we've got to start putting our money where our mouths are in terms of doing good. So instead of just giving money away, we said, how can we have the biggest impact on the area we are passionate about, which is the ocean? So the money doesn't benefit from us throwing money into the ocean, but it does benefit from us addressing overfishing, plastic, etc., etc. So we said, how can we address those problems where there is not enough funding, where there seems to be a lack, and where we think we can make an impact. And that's where we decided to say, we as a family office are willing to take risk, we're willing to take long-term perspectives, and therefore we'll start to impact investing. And we saw a gap, especially at the early stages, where we saw a lot of really good ideas, but we didn't necessarily see their ability to scale. So we said, well, if we can step in there and help them to grow. We thought that was a brilliant idea, so we ran out to say to all the other family offices, we have found the holy grail, we're brilliant, just invest a lot of money into this area because you will save the planet. And as our friends from Hong Kong said this morning is, Asians just want to know how much money am I going to make. So the impact investment was perhaps the wrong term. Perhaps we should have said, we believe that we can invest our money into sustainable solutions that will generate 15 to 20% of return annualized net. I think that might have been a better argument. And I think I've been missing that a little bit in the discussion about impact is you can actually make money. We certainly want to do good, but we're also good old-fashioned Asians, even though I don't look like that, and we want to make money, and we want to make even more so we can give it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. And we heard from the debate earlier, whatever gets measured gets done. So John, you run an actual impact fund. You're seeing interesting solutions, and I would love to hear more about it.
Yeah, and I'd echo what Thomas was saying there. I mean, when I go to these conferences, I'm back to doing about 2 or 3 conferences a month now. And what I want to hear as an investor is someone to sit up on stage with a project and say, here's my project, I need $50 million. I'm going to return you a 15% IRR or 20% IRR, and I'm going to give you your money back in 8 years. Right? And here are the risks. Right? And less emphasis on that, just tell me what the returns are going to be primarily. That's really what I want to hear. I want to hear that story. So if there's any level of disappointment today, it's that I'm not hearing enough of that, because this is an impact investing event. It's about unlocking capital for sustainable investment. So if we want to make investment sustainable, let's turn that around and say sustainable investment is about making sure that we have sustainable returns. Because the more that we can prove out a sustainable return, the more investment is going to come into this space. Just a slight correction, come on what you said earlier. Hatcher is a fund platform. We have one of our funds is a fund that focuses on investing in regenerative farming and mangrove restoration. We have another smaller fund that invests in supporting technologies called Carbon Nation X. So Carbon Nation Blue invests in mangroves, invests in algae, and Carbon Nation Earth invests in soil organic carbon, primarily farmland in Australia. Every one of the projects that we greenlight has a better than 15% IRR. It has to get into consideration for that fund. One of the things I just wanted to point out that Fred said from Gen Zero, which I thought was just terrific, is he said that every project that they look at, they're basically asking the question, what's the best way to scale and create impact? And that's the same thing for us. We're asking just that one additional question of what's the best way to scale, create impact, and generate a return. The last thing I would say is what we've learned from our venture funds is that venture is about 2 things. We only invest in scale and efficiency. They're the same thing, essentially. So if I can come to you with a project that requires $100 million to restore mangrove swamps, and I can prove that I can do that for $2,200 per hectare in terms of replanting and regrowing this, and I can prove to you that I can get a 15 to 17% IRR on that, that's brilliant, because when I restore that mangrove, I'm restoring fish that breed in the mangroves, I'm protecting against rising ocean levels, I'm protecting that village there, I'm paying everyone in that village to help us replant those mangroves. No one loses in this scenario. It's a fantastic way to invest, push money back. What do I get in return? Carbon credits. And so for anyone that was a bit dubious on the carbon credit thing earlier, carbon credits are awesome. They're a great way to go to a community in Africa. I was just in Africa 2 weeks ago telling this story. It's a great way to go to a community with that story and say, here's $100 million, let's replant a third of your coastline. That goes down pretty well in those things. There's no one in that room saying carbon credits are a bad thing. Everyone's saying carbon credits are awesome if you're going to replant 1/3 of the coastline of this country.
Again, it's useful to hear that, you know, there's scope for carbon credit market. There's an opportunity there. UNDP as a leading agency, a leading development agency, what do you do in terms of engaging on this sustainable finance piece and bringing the different panelists and working with them to achieve sustainable finance goals and sustainable development agenda?
Thank you, and good afternoon. It's a very, very big question, so give me a minute or two. So UNDP, the UN Development Programme, we are in the UN system the steward of all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And obviously finance plays a really key role for every single one of those goals as well. Within UNDP, we have 170 country offices around the world. They're working on governance, they're working on policy, regulation, public and private finance frameworks, processes and tools. And then we're also working at the global levels, so through things like the G20 in this region, other global platforms as well. But as we mentioned earlier, there's actually obviously been some tremendously difficult few years for everyone around the world. In 2020, we saw the first increases in global poverty for 2 decades. Actually, we've just launched our new Human Development Report, which has defined what we call a new uncertainty complex. So we're looking at climate and biodiversity, inequality, and technological challenges, how they're all kind of feeding off each other at unprecedented scale and also unprecedented pace as well. But in terms of how we bring finance back into this, there's obviously a key role for finance to play in tackling all of these challenges. And within UNDP, we do this in a number of different ways. The first is that we have our Global Sustainable Finance Hub, which is looking to position sustainability at the heart of finance. The second is that we have initiatives like our $1 trillion Moonshot initiative, where we're looking to mobilize the best and the most of public and private resource tackling the SDGs. And then the third one is elements like our UNDP strategic plan, which is founded on sustainable finance. I'd just like to unpack in a little bit more detail before I finish. When we look at sustainable finance, we almost look at kind of, I think, a value chain approach with this, and we play roles at different elements of that value chain. The first is that we're working upstream with governments to scope investments, to define investments, to look at how we shape the regulatory and the policy environment. We're then working with the private sector to kind of crowd in capital around things like blended finance, but also to increase knowledge and understanding and engagement with the SDGs, including things like our SDG investment maps, our SDG standards, to look at really focusing investments on where they're most needed. But then through our country offices, we're also working at the very, very last mile. So we're working on building and shaping products and services, blended business models, to make sure that no one's left behind either. So we're working at all stages of those value chains, including with partners like the ones you see on the stage here. Thank you.
And you heard a number of impact themes. You know, you heard Ruma investing in oceans. You've heard from John looking at similar themes, but also carbon credits. What are the other, I mean, we know S is a key component of ESG. What are the other sort of impact themes you're focused on as an organization?
Yeah, thanks, Kamal. I think there are a lot of, also, obviously besides the environmental aspects, there's a lot on the S side. And the two sort of that are really dear to us would be healthcare and education. We're really trying to, I mean, we look at the context of Asia, democratize access to health and affordable healthcare is really pressing, right? And that's scaling, unfortunately, because of what COVID has brought, particularly in emerging markets. So we're looking at things like health tech platforms, low-cost affordable clinics and hospitals, all the way to even investing in our European counterparts, which is robotic surgery for cheaper robotic surgery for micro-access surgeries. So things like that. So I think impact can play a big role in healthcare. Education, don't even need to talk about the e-health, education, edtech opportunity here. That's very, very big. We have invested in quite a few of them in India, in Latin America, in early child development and so forth. So I think these two are very interesting. I do want to talk about the convergence of both, because quite often people look at sector lines, and I want to reinforce something that I said earlier, which is when you're looking at poverty, poverty is a multi-sectorial beast. Okay, it's got many, many sectors. So just because you invest in a farm that lifts the income of the smallholder families, if you don't give access to healthcare, education, crop insurance, if you don't give access to electric mobility eventually, right, and just the ability to move around and get income, you're not really tackling the beast. So quite often I like to say, how do we engage these sectors meaningfully? And obviously Thomas and I know, being talking earlier about being big divers, most of our poorest communities in Southeast Asia, you know, they're coastal communities, right? So how do you interact between terrestrial and marine? right? Whenever you do the blue carbon, yes, that's great from an environmental standpoint, but how do you pass that value to the communities that live there, right? So I think sometimes we need to challenge ourselves a little bit better with this intersectorial thinking. And I think to your point there, that's where the growth opportunities are.
Can I pick up on that? Because we just came back from Africa where we met with a number of people there regarding coastal mangrove restoration. By the way, mangroves are awesome. They don't look very nice. They don't, there's better looking trees, but they soak up 10 times, 3 times, 5 times more carbon than pretty much anything else on the planet. They're just amazing plants. We've lost 60% of them globally. So that's a real problem. Now, what happens when you lose mangroves near your village? When mangroves go away, so does a proportionate number of fish. So mangroves are very necessary to breeding fish. If you don't have mangroves, you don't have small fish, you don't have large fish. If you establish a fishery near that village and that fishery pumps a bunch of nitrogen and phosphorus out into the ocean, you lose the mangroves. So you lose the ability to protect your waterline, you lose the ability to grow fish, which is the primary source of revenue for many villages in many countries. So what you have to do is go to each of these communities and start there. You've got to think about it from the community standpoint. And as a fund owner, what I like to do is think about a 10-year horizon. And the IFC's done a lot of really good work in this area, so has the UN, where you think about in terms of a project and your return on that project, and then how you would then devolve the asset back into the hands of the people that had it. So the model we use for blue carbon is we go into a community, we pay the community to restore the mangroves over typically a 3-year period. Then in the next 7 years, typically what we're trying to do is get our money back from that initial planning project, plus our 15% IRR. And then at the end of that, we go from an 80-20 sharing model on the carbon revenue, and we flip that model back to the community. And what this means is we're essentially handing the asset back to the community. So it's not a colonization exercise we heard about earlier. It's actually going in there, restoring the community. It's almost the opposite of that, where we're taking capital from the West and we're going in there and saying, let's return this reserve to this area to the pristine state that it was before. Let's make some money on top of that as our return for that capital, and then let's hand it back to you so that you can continue to make money on that by leaving the mangroves alone and leaving them in this state and helping all the rest of us save the world. So there are models that can work that are very commercial and very suitable to investment in this space.
Thomas, other than oceans, what other impact investing themes are you looking at, and how do you approach, as a family office, how do you approach impact investing?
So when I say ocean, it's fairly broad. So for instance, we are investing into alternative proteins because we think that will help overfishing, prevent overfishing, and so forth. So it's a relatively broad theme. I have to say also that as a family, we're not always extremely disciplined. So once in a while, we follow the principle that if something really pisses you off or you're really passionate about it, spend some money on trying to fix it. And that sometimes gets us a little bit off track. So we've invested in, for instance, mycelium, which you might be familiar with, which is a mushroom to replace leather in fashion. And we've done that because we're really upset about how animals generally are treated. So we said, if we can do anything in our way to address that. Our family is originally our wealth, not my wealth. Our wealth is founded out of property. And we feel that property is one of the major issues in the world from both construction and general usage. So one of the areas we're starting to look into now is alternative building materials. So can we find ways to replace cement, replace steel, and so on in a long-term manner? So again, kind of applying the same thing. We'd love to invest in Southeast Asia because we think Southeast Asia is underfunded. We like to use Singapore because we think governance and the system here works well. And we like to work with funders who like to work with us. So we're not happy about just giving money away. We're not trying to change the way they operate. We love what they do, but we like to bring our network of connections. We think that's part of the value that we bring to the companies we invest in. So we look at that. So I would say 90% of our investments are areas that are relatively close to the ocean. And I can tell you that 15% in mangroves makes me all warm and fuzzy, to be honest. So we're going to have a talk. But but I think the opportunities are there. But once in a while we have areas where we say we've got to do something here, and we think there's a good return. We never make investments in this side of the family, so venture capital, where there's no impact. So we always start with impact. If there's no positive impact, we don't do it. Then we look at returns, and sometimes even if we see something that doesn't have a return, but we love the impact, we'll park it over at the philanthropy side, and we'll hope to get our money back. But we're quite driven by returns. But once in a while, passion takes over.
That's what we like to do at AVPN, help connect people, and it's great to see, even as panelists, we can facilitate those connections. Callum, how does UNDP, how can people, private investors, engage with UNDP?
I'm happy to answer, and also very happy to speak to you all after this if I can dive deeper as well. So I think there's a few different areas that the private sector and private investors in particular can play a role. The first is actually with governments. What we often hear from funders and investors is that they don't have a lack of money, they have a lack of investable projects. So I think actually working with governments and others to build the kind of skills within the public sector to better define, to better scope investments, I think is very, very important. On the other side of that as well, working with government and others to start shaping the regulatory, the policy, the other environments, because often some of these elements don't always align with sustainable development as well. And then also, just remaining with the government context for a little bit longer, how do we shape really kind of meaningful public-private partnerships, particularly when we look at the kind of last mile, things like blended business models, blended finance, and other elements too. But I think on the more private sector side, there's a few areas that I think we see as real priorities. The first is really kind of robust measurement. There's many different impact frameworks out there. We're working on a number. There's many on our website, but just a commitment to robust measurement. And again, we're very happy to work with you all on starting to shape that kind of thinking too. The second is wherever you can nudge your investments onto that kind of sustainability pathway for your benefit, but also so we have a bigger pipeline of investable opportunities for all of us as well. The third is more ambitious, but we need to start looking at regenerative businesses and investments. Our Secretary General actually spoke about this yesterday at the UN General Assembly in New York. It's not going to happen overnight. There's going to be an enormous transition, but it's very much heading in the right direction. I think is really important for that kind of momentum. And then just finally, to pick up on a point I mentioned earlier, we also look to you all for inspiration. I mentioned earlier our kind of point about the Human Development Report and its new uncertainty complex. We've seen around the world unprecedented reversals in human development. So about 90% of countries, we've seen these reversals happen. And in some countries, we're seeing divergence. So it's getting bad everywhere, but it's getting especially bad in some places. And we really kind of risk another lost decade of sustainable development. But what we also see in this kind of uncertainty is that uncertainty provides opportunity too. So we look to you all for that kind of leadership. We need new ways of working, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things as well. And with that in mind, I'm pitching this report quite heavily, but the Human Development Report sets out 3 different I's that I think could be quite interesting for all of you. The first is investment. So we need investment in renewable energy, in pandemic preparedness, and also mitigating and tackling and adapting to natural hazards. The second I is that we need insurance, so social protection for the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, the most at risk of being left behind and further ignored. And then the third I that we need is innovation. So in our economies, in technology, in our cultures as well, particularly to tackle the known and the unknown challenges that we're all facing as a global community. So there's a bit of a pitch there, but I'll stop on that.
No, it's also a great segue for us to reach out to the audience because, we learn from you up here as well, just as you learn from us. So I've got a few questions coming on Slido, but there's mics going around in the room as well. So if anybody wants to raise their hand and ask a question, please do.
Yeah. Hi. My question is that, while impact investment is gaining ground, there's a lot more to go. And catalytic capital, blended finance, there's a lot of talk about that. But the question is, who is really going to provide this catalytic finance and blended capital in adequate amount? I mean, there are a few examples here and there, but who is really who can and who is in a position to provide this catalytic capital and blended finance? And the second question is to N, asking about impact investment. What percentage of the family offices, I think what Thomas represents is a very small fraction, I may be wrong, what percentage of the family offices are really or what percentage of their investments is an impact investment? Those are the two questions I'd like answered.
Who wants to take the first one? Yeah.
What was the first one again?
You've got my strategy now.
The quantum of blended finance and who's going to do it and what amount?
So there's two reports you can get on Google. They're totally free. You can download them in a couple of minutes. One is the UBS Family Office report that was published in June 2022, and the other is the Camden Wealth report that was published in March. And they have many of the answers, I think, that you're looking for. We're doing quite a bit of work with UBS at the moment, and those guys have just fantastic data on what family offices are doing. Just in the area of venture, which is an area that we play in as well, family offices are 10 times more active than they were 12 years ago. Just as an indication, I think family offices are vitally important. I mean, Thomas, you mentioned that you started in property. I think family offices, so sometimes it's easier for them to conceptualize a project and get behind it and finance it, and usually it's something that they want to be involved in. So I've noticed a lot of interest from family offices that I meet with, but the real money is from the institutions, and it's boundless at the moment. There is so much money that is chasing good, well thought out structures, projects. There's more capital, I think, available than there are opportunities, to be quite honest. So it's on us to come up with those very well thought out financial models and structures and projects to put it in front of these guys so that they can start deploying the capital.
Yeah, and I think I'll add to that. I think the point I was trying to make is if you look at the capital markets, the 85 trillion or the 100 trillion, depending on which report that you read, the lion's share of all of that comes from institutional investors, pensions, endowments, insurance, and large asset managers. So we as a firm has been focused on that segment because we know that the biggest scale of capital is there, and therefore that's the capital that we need to move, and that's probably the slowest to move, right? So at least in Singapore, you can see the stuff that's happening, the positive stuff with Temasek, all the way to GIC. These are the kind of institutional investors that we need to engage. I think that's the first point. The second point, obviously, on family offices, there's a lot of buzz, particularly in Singapore. If you look at EDB's and MAS's reports, there were 700 set up in 2021 and 500 the year before. So many of them came under the 13X regime, which means that they at least have 50 million. So when you do the math and you just do a rough calculation, right, you know there's a lot of wealth sitting there, right? So we need to get more of them to be like Thomas, to have a very clear strategy of how they want to fund. So I think those two things are directly moving in the right place. But the problem is that you haven't really got the urgency there. I don't see the capital being deployed as fast as we hope that they have. And that's where risk-sharing models like blended finance comes in. Because the idea behind blended finance is you're trying to get development capital or philanthropic capital to de-risk such that investment capital can go in. And the question there is, as we all see in orchestras, the music's so beautiful, right? They each play their individual instruments, but who should play the conductor? And that's a hard one to answer. But I think there are a couple of good examples. There are two, at least, reports on blended finance that have come out recently. The Tropical Finance Facility is one example in Indonesia that has done quite well in terms of blended finance, but for environmental and smallholder farmers.
Thomas, you wanted to answer.
So before we get too happy about what we're doing in Ruma, and I think Jessica would agree that we're one of the more active families in this space. We probably have less than 5% of our assets, and it's a lot less than 5%, to be honest, that we have deployed so far. We've got a lot of our assets that are in illiquid property, and we have a strong ambition to grow. So if you're saying, if you're looking for a percentage based on our experience, we are very low. We've got quite a bold ambition of where we want to go in within the next 10 years, and we're really deploying now. And there are several, companies in here we've invested in, so we're happy about that. But we've got a long way to go. So if we are in the better half or the better quartile, I can tell you that percentage number is very small. But that also then gives an amazing opportunity if we can convince people that there is real returns here, that if you can unleash some of that capital. I agree, ultimately getting banks and financial institutions involved, but especially to get many of these businesses to an investable size, which is often where the problem is. I think family offices have an amazing role to play. Family offices have become fancy. All of us who have a certain amount of wealth, and it doesn't have to be billions of dollars, right?
We've got quite a few questions on Slido, so I'm going to take one from there, and then we'll go. Oh, okay. We've got some.
Good evening. So we have been talking about impact investing, responsible investing, but the fact still remains, as humanity, we still invest a lot more money on fossil fuel than we invest on anything else. That's the reality that we are facing today. So what role can family businesses, impact investor play in confronting the fossil fuel industry and pushing out money from that industry, taking away their social licenses, the way they took the social license away from coal? But the fact being that IFC, World Bank, ATB, everyone, or even the big banks, still want to invest in oil and gas. So the philanthropists, the investors, can they stand up to big powers and say, like, hey, we have an alternate model where we can end up making similar money, but that does not involve destruction of our planet? Because, no one is listening.
No, it's a hot potato, I think. I was on the phone last night for a 2-hour meeting with someone who was trying to get us to invest in a very large coal mining facility, right? And I was making the point that we're impact investors and we're investing in carbon credits and whatnot. They were saying, well, what if we split the revenue such that you could take this amount of revenue off and buy? It was just this. It was not a great story, to be honest. And so the problem is people going to try and find ways to live within whatever framework we come up with for impact investing, and try and find ways to play along with that. I think what I would assume that most of the people on the panel here are involved in are real solutions, not greenwashing, not things that just nod and wink and tip a hat at these things. And so I would say for most of the families here, I think the research is out there for you to be able to find solutions like the ones that we're talking about here today, that there are viable ways that you can jump in and really make an impact and earn decent returns on that. I think that's the message that we're trying to put across here, is that you don't need to get involved in the projects that are around the edges here, and you probably shouldn't. The problem with coal and everything else is I do think it's a bit, most of us would look at this realistically and say some of these targets are going to be tough. The idea that we can get half the world to stop eating meat is probably unrealistic. So there's some unrealistic things that we do need to buy into. So leaving that, I think what I tend to do is just leave that aside and recognize that some things are unrealistic and do what we can to make certain projects realistic where they wouldn't have been realistic before. So try and sort of mitigate things that way is what my suggestion would be. I don't know if Thomas, if you have a different view.
No, I absolutely agree, but I also think this is where I sometimes get frustrated with all of us, and it includes me, right? We are all activists if we want to be, right? I'm sure that you have a pension, you've invested in a bank and so on. My view is start calling them up and complaining and saying, okay, like I got so we also have a traditional investment portfolio, and I got an ESG fund. So we've got like a rough ESG, and the list of investments was, it was Alphabet, it was Apple, it was Microsoft, and it was ExxonMobil, because it was an ESG fund. And I was like, are you insane, right? If there is enough of us in the room who talks to the same bank and says, are you insane? I bet you it will change. It's no different than many other things. Sorry, you'll hear I'm passionate about this. Fashion, fast fashion. Oh, Zara and H&M should change. What are you doing about it? What are we doing about it? Are we stopping? Are we telling Zara and saying, you guys have to change the way you behave, otherwise I won't buy your shit? I bet you, sorry, large commercial organizations are very savvy. The moment where we start behaving differently, they will listen. And I think it's too easy often for all of us to go, oh, government should put in new regulations. Well, you know what? I don't buy anything from Zara anymore. I just don't believe in it, right? I don't. I'm sure it's a wonderful company. But unless I stop doing something, they're not going to do differently. And I gave a little bit of feedback to Jessica on a project that she's supporting, where I'm like, why are we supporting this, right? We should show the flag. So I think we can all be activists. Sorry.
I want to add to this one. And thank you for the question, because these are kind of provocative questions I think you should ask us, right? We should think about. But this Chatham House rules, correct? It is, right? Is it?
Maybe it starts.
It starts now. This statement is Chatham House. So the first point I want to say, because I'm very pent up about this question as well, is that it's actually a very complicated answer to your question, okay? Because you just said government should do it. Who votes government in? If you trace fossil fuel subsidies, they're some of the biggest lobby groups that fund governments. Okay, that's one level of attack. The next level of attack is in the same week that the Inflation Act came out with whatever 300 million for fossil fuel, for renewables and so forth, the amount of subsidies was about the same for fossil fuels. Okay, so the second level that you can attack the question. I know Komal has had me to comment on this, and I sort of skip the issue. But everything that we talk about, you need to factor in what's the macroeconomic situation. Take Russia and Ukraine. The number of institutional investors that had very solid ESG policies. But because Russia attacked Ukraine, there was an impact on food and energy security. So immediately these pension funds had to revise the ESG to invest back in fossil fuels. Because you take Germany, 55% of the country's energy comes from natural gas from Russia. So if you take the morality out, just purely economic and viability, they had to find an alternative. And I think that's where we need to think. I absolutely agree that we should voice it out, we should be activists, but you should think that it's quite complicated sometimes. And one of the comments I made earlier to Thomas actually and to Jess was that, you know, time has shown that morality does not mobilize capital, okay? Opportunity does. And I think we got to be careful going down the judgmental route, because I used to be like that when I first came in the space. But when you realize how everything ties together, it's very, very complex.
Callum, I mean, the other thing about divestment is just transition. As and when you move out of these industries, you have to make sure there's adequate employment opportunities, no one's left behind as you transition to a greener economy. What is UNDP doing to address issues such as these?
Many things. These are enormous, multifaceted, truly kind of generational challenges as well. I think when we're looking at our country office level, a lot of our work is around lives and livelihoods. So it might be employment support, it might be broader subsidies, it's training, it's reskilling, it's working with the public sector around policies and that kind of enabling environment. I do think the morality side is still very, very important. That is a hugely important campaign to run with. So again, at the global level, we're advocating for this as well. Our Secretary General yesterday launched a General Assembly formally. His speech is now online, sets out a number of initiatives that we're looking to do around this transition. It is enormous though, it's unprecedented, and it is going to take time. And it's not just something that one government or one individual can do themselves. It is truly, as I mentioned, a completely all-encompassing challenge as well. The other point I'd mention is where how we can all work together on this as well. Where we've done this in the past, it's tended to be quite siloed. You know, governments are doing something, the private sector is doing something else. Then the kind of global institutions as well are leading a different charge. For this, collaboration is really fundamental. So learning from each other, collaborating, recognizing that no one has the solutions right now to a lot of this, like it hasn't been tested at this kind of scale. So being open to learning, adapting, and being on that journey together, I think is really, really essential.
Yeah, can I just say something as well? And as a shout out to the UN, I think all of the private companies that we've invested in rely on data that's been created by largely government sources and the UN. So it's very hard for us, for example, we have an investment in a satellite company that does carbon sensing in orbit, and we would not be able to figure out what the degradation levels are without the Landsat data and the other government data that's been generated over the last 30 or 40 years. So I think a lot of these private initiatives are very reliant on what you guys are doing, and that's in the data space.
I'm afraid there's no time for questions from the audience, but I do have a rapid fire question for each of my panelists. So John, I'd like to start with you. What are the most critical next steps for the impact investment ecosystem to get back on track with view to meeting the 2030 SDG agenda?
How much time do we have? Look, it just comes down to investing in, I'll just repeat what I said earlier. If you meet someone that's got a very sensibly put together project with a good financial model and you're convinced of the returns, I'd use the word that my fellow panelists have used, you know, do something, activate that investment, make it happen, because we can all sit here and talk all day about what we plan to do or what we would like to do. But if someone comes to you and they've got a project that is well thought out, that's going to benefit everyone in that project, get on board, put some money to work and get involved. And maybe the project gets you a 13% IRR or whatever. Learn for the next time, and you'll develop your facility as an investor, but you need to get started. You need to put money to work. This is about unlocking capital for sustainability. So let's unlock the capital. Let's get more capital pouring into these projects, and that will beget more projects, and doing so will make this world a better place.
Thomas?
So I don't know whether it's the biggest thing, but I'm originally born in Denmark. 15 years ago, the Danish government said we will not buy any vegetables that are not organic anymore for any government entities, schools, offices, the army, and so on. Over the last 15 years, that means that organic vegetables have become price competitive in Denmark with normal vegetables. And in fact, the Danish organic industry has become competitive outside Denmark and generating revenue. I think that governments around the world should start putting their money where their mouth is in respect to this, and start investing, not just putting money away for projects, but saying people who do the right thing, we buy from them, because that will drive growth, revenue, investability, and I think that's a very easy way to do it.
I think for me, having been in the space for a long time, I think the two extremes ends of the spectrum are very interesting for me. People that either sing from the same song sheet or completely opposite. But the problem is that many people in the middle are apathetic. They don't even have an opinion to move. And I think I take the point that each one of us here, you obviously have an opinion, you like the space, but we need to massively evangelize to get the people in the middle, the apathetic group, to have an opinion. And so I think that's one thing, because I've realized through this decade of doing this that unless anyone personalizes their own impact and tries to put it in the way that they walk, they cannot persuade others. And I think that's a problem. I think there are many people walking, we're just not walking fast enough, and there are not that many of us in the right places to shift capital as urgently as should be.
So I'll reaffirm earlier the three I's, so investment, insurance, and innovation. But also, I think John made a really good point here on the data piece. A personal frustration for me is so much of what you do is locked away behind NDAs, commercial confidentiality, and so on. For us, we just need more talking, more openness, more learning from each other. No one has figured this out. So the more we can be talking, events like this are very, very important, but just fundamentally, the more we can be learning from each other, sharing what does, and also most importantly, what doesn't work, I think is really, really essential. So just keep talking to each other, keep talking to us, I think is really important.
Thank you, everyone. That's all we've got time for, but what we have learned is that there is enough capital out there, but you need to take an activist stance. You can't be that apathetic person sitting on the sidelines. It's important to be involved. We're a self-select group in here anyway, but we need to go beyond this room. We need to speak to our neighbors. We need to speak to our friends. We need to evangelize, as Ern pointed out. So it's important that we take this conversation outside this door as well. This is the end of my session, and I'd like to thank the panelists again, and I'd like to hand over to the next fireside chat.